property, but even when that happens, you go in the overstory, you get all this new growth underneath, so that can change your whole habitat because your overstory has been affected.
All right, so up next we have Dave. He is with the Nature Conservancy. He's a senior conservation scientist, and he's going to talk about deer and habitat quality and kind of how they work and play together.
All right, thanks. As Anna says, I am a senior conservation scientist, and that's because of all the white hair.
That's the senior part.
That's the senior part, yeah. So I can see I'm with a lot of good company here. So what I want to do is just kind of give an overview of deer relative to habitat, and then why it's important to do the browse measurements. And then Gary will go into more detail on some of the plant species that are of different degrees of preference by deer, and Anna will talk about the specific deer browse methods that she's proposing to measure on the ground. So just look at this as an overview. And my background is mostly in birds, so I do have a couple of birds I showed here too. Let's know and how they relate to deer. So with that, we'll get started. So I think the first thing, whether you're talking about deer or anything else, is that we really want to keep healthy habitats in Michigan that support deer, that support birds, that support salamanders and everything all together, so that over time these habitats are maintained and the populations of everything are maintained as much as we can. There are always trade-offs, as we know, so it's not a perfect system, but we want to keep as much out there as we can. And so that depends on good management at sites, and also a lot of nearby sites of varying distances, because we know the deer wander around, and say in the UP, as I understand it, they migrate as much as 50 miles. So when you try to talk about management at these various scales, you're really talking about huge areas. So if you take a look at these paired slides here, on the left side there's virtually nothing coming back. On this side you get a lot of shrubs, and this is what we want to see. So however we manage the landscape and whatever the factors are that are influencing the growth of these shrubs, we want to promote in some way, and that'll provide the browse for deer, it'll provide nesting sites for birds. As these trees come down, it provides the stuff for salamanders and so on. So that's kind of a sort of a big picture. And if you look at, say this is a white trillium here. It's just a small flower that comes out in the spring. It's in the lily family. Deer love to eat lilies. So this is in a landscape where you have pretty heavy deer browse and very few trilliums, and where you don't have deer, so as many, you got a lot of them. So this, if you have more trilliums, ideally, as Brent talked about, you can potentially increase carrying capacity because this is good food for deer. This makes it worse. And you get a lot more sedges and stuff, which is not as nutritious for deer. So there's a trade-off already that you see. And this has pretty serious implications too, because how old do you think these trilliums are? Any guesses? They can be up to 50 years old. Very slow growing plants, so they're almost as old as the trees. In some cases they might even be older. So that's one of the reasons when Brent talked about the deer population not recovering as fast, it could reflect the fact that these things aren't coming back.
Do they spread by roots or by seeds?
By rhizomes and by seeds. Ants actually carry some of the seeds and plant them somewhere else. So why do we measure deer browse? One is to achieve DNR objectives. So we do want to manage the deer population so that the vegetation is maintained over time. We also want to manage a habitat for the long-term survivorship of the deer, quality deer hunts, whatever it is we want, while limiting the negative impacts to habitats for other wildlife. And again, that balance is not always an easy one to achieve. We also want the long-term ecological health of your property, for where you probably have other products or outputs from your property other than deer too. Maybe you have some timber harvest and other things you're trying to achieve. So you want to keep that going as well. And also keep in mind that every property contributes to habitat quality overall, but also it requires all the property owners working together when you've got something that moves around like deer to begin to work together to get the best output for everybody's property individually as well as collectively. And hopefully when that's done, all these other species together will also benefit. And you'll keep your woods and the landscape going in a healthy way. Again, it's a really tough order to do, but it's really what we're shooting for. So just to give you some ideas on what happens, what can happen, on a lot of the islands in Lake Michigan, deer were not there naturally. All the deer out there have been introduced. Beaver Island, the Manitous, and so forth. But not all islands have had deer introduced. Where deer have been introduced, it's usually been in places where they don't have predators. So the deer population has gone way, way up, much higher than normal. When that happens, you get heavy browse, and everyone is familiar with the browse line you get on white cedar like this. The forest understory becomes very minimal. A lot of the native plants disappear, and some species that once were common out there virtually disappear altogether. So things like Canada yew, which is it's a candy to deer, and it's really used particularly in the winter as a nutritious food, virtually disappears under that heavy browsing pressure, which reduces the carrying capacity. And then you lose your lilies and orchids and other things as well that deer tend to forage on. On the other hand, where you don't have the deer, you can see that this is white cedar right here, and it's growing up very well. So you're going to sustain that white cedar for the deer over the long term. You get little browse, the forest understory is intact, you get a lot more native plants. When you have more native plants, then the deer have a wider variety of plants to select from for foraging, and you support other wildlife as well. So this is kind of an extreme contrast, if you will, but it is something we are seeing here in Michigan. So, if we look at some of the favorite browse species in deer, we'll go into even more detail on this. One, it would be eastern hemlock, and it's also very valuable as thermal cover for deer in the winter. So when that starts to get browsed out, then you can lose those stands over time. Plus and keep in mind that some of these trees are in danger for other reasons as well. There's a small insect that carries a fungus that kills the tree that's been introduced from Eurasia. And it's as close as Ohio right now. So we've got other things that are threatening deer habitat. They also tend to favor things like orchids, the trilliums that we've already talked about. This is the Canada yew in the understory. This is an exclosure on Boblo Island, just east of Mackinac Island. Got the measure. It's been up, I think, for 30 years. You can see how thick the yew is inside, and outside it's gone. So that means that the carrying capacity is reduced. You get red osier dogwood and oak. These are some of the favorite species, and Gary will describe some of these in more detail. So the consequences of some of this is you get plants that deer don't like, which further reduces the carrying capacity. So you get bracken fern in some cases. It's abundant anyway on sandy soil, and it comes in after fires, as you know. But you get other ferns as well that come in. You get a lot of beech tree, but that's also getting killed by another introduced insect, beech scale, so that's a kind of a double whammy here instead of sugar maple that the deer like to forage on. And then this is cedar up by Cedarville in the UP. This is white cedar up here in the canopy, but there's no white cedar here at all. It's all balsam fir, which is starvation food. So even Cedarville may have to change its name to Balsamville, I don't know. Other things happen after that too. If you take away the native plants, then I've seen an area again up by Cedarville, just east of the Mackinac Bridge, where the thistle is the only thing in the understory. Really bad. I mean, it's just everything is wiped out in the understory. Whereas you get to the east end of the island, right by Lake Huron, that things are looking really good. So it's kind of a local problem, but it's one you can see really easily. And then introduce species like garlic mustard that maybe a number of you have seen come into your property recently. It's got these white flowers in the spring. It smells like garlic. It just takes over. And that too is not eaten by deer, but as they move through, they spread the seeds, which makes the problem worse over time. And even deer are known to eat little birds. There have been photos where that's actually happened. Rare. But some of the birds that lose, when you lose the shrub layer, this chestnut-sided warbler, this is it's a 1 ounce bird that migrates all the way down to Central America for the winter. And then it likes to build its nest in shrubs anywhere from maybe 3 to 15 feet tall. So these guys lose out when you lose your shrubs. And this is a Canada warbler, the same thing. They kind of build their nest, in this case on the ground, but it's always under shrubs and where there's a lot of cover, and so these two will disappear. So as you start looking around at your property, depending on where you are in the state, you can try to even begin to get to know the birds a little bit better, and that can be part of a monitoring program. And there's a whole program set up by Cornell called eBird, where you can remotely enter your data, and it figures into a huge big database to help look at population trends over time. So it would be kind of a cool thing to do too. You know, if you're looking at a really good, healthy habitat, this is it. Here are the sugar maples up here in the canopy, and you got the young sugar maple saplings coming in. Very little evidence to browse. This will make the foresters happy. If you've got a sustained forestry program on your property, this is what you want, given the fact that sugar maple has high value, and it will come in and recruit and keep that sugar maple in the landscape over time. On the other hand, if you get too much browsing, this is what you get. This is in the same general area, but it's all balsam fir, and all the sugar maple's getting browsed out. So if you look at it from a sustainable forestry perspective, you've lost already, unless you want balsam fir pulp. The browsing impacts for deer vary a lot, depending on where you are in the state. In the snowbelt counties of the UP, the densities are less, and this is where you tend to still have the most diverse forests, where you get some of the highest quality sugar maple comes out of some of those areas. And then as you get to the areas that are in yellow or green, this kind of green is where the densities are highest, and where you tend to see more severe problems of browse. And so this may be where you look at your management more carefully relative to not only deer, but forest production and other parts, other outputs you want from your land, to try to figure out what that balance is. It's going to be toughest in this general part of the state. So in general, what you want to record, I think, for browsing, and again, Anna will go into a lot more detail when she describes the method for looking at browsing, but you want to look at your high, medium, and low preference species. If you're starting to lose your high preference species, that's what you would predict first. Then you're starting to see early evidence of too much browsing, and you may want to look at your deer management and the deer density in that area a little bit more critically. You lose your medium preference species, and you've got a more severe problem. And if you look at your low preference species, like some of the areas I mentioned where the balsam fir and even spruce is being browsed, you've got a huge problem. And there's probably not a lot you can do in managing that land. And in doing that, then you have to look at the number of these plants, you have to look at the condition, how heavily browsed they are, that is the height and the amount of browsing on each plant, their distribution. So there are some areas, again in this area, where it's all the Canada thistles come in, the balsam fir is browsed out, the cedar is browsed out, but there's some really high limestone rocks, and you got a whole different set of plants up there. Elderberry, birch, yellow birch, sugar maple, that are not reached by the deer. And then you want to look at, you've got to measure consistently over time to get a trend. So all those are important things to keep in mind, and Anna will describe her monitoring procedure to try to get at some of those questions. So this is just kind of a rough indication of how you begin to look at browse intensity, from very little damage and all the branches are intact to really severe, where you're getting virtually nothing happening. And here's an example of a sugar maple that's browsed really heavily. So once you see this kind of pattern where it's being snipped off every year, you can be pretty sure that your forest is going to change over time, unless you do something about it. Some high preference species include yellow birch here, and you're probably pretty familiar with the rough bark and the kind of the spearmint smell it has. The red maple over here and the sugar maple here are all species that if you get really too many deer over too long a period of time, you'll tend to see reductions in the number of plants and the density of these species. Other high preference species, and I know it varies a little bit where you are in the state. White pine in some areas I don't see it being browsed too heavily, but in other areas it is. But it's generally considered a high preference species. Sumac in some areas. Dogwood is hit just about everywhere. And nannyberry is hit, also browsed very heavily. As far as I know, deer do not eat adult cedar waxwings. Northern white cedar is, boy, that's just the favorite, as you know. And so here's really some really nice examples where it's coming back in again. As it matures, it'll provide thermal cover. As you get wind throw, openings will come up, it will recruit, and you continue to have that staying on the landscape. Here's another good example of it. This is what you don't want. When you get to this kind of point, you're losing your high quality forage over the winter and thermal cover potentially, depending on what replaces it. So some of the medium preference species are things like witch hazel, ash, which unfortunately the ash borer is taken care of, aspens, and we were just talking about how aspens are pretty popular with the deer and pretty as forage, and oaks in many areas as well. And others are jack pine, again, depending on where you are. At least up around Mile, I don't see it browse too much, but some areas it is. And again, we talked a little bit about hemlock. A lot of places the hemlock doesn't come in anyway just because it's shaded out. But in areas which the real test of whether it's going to come in is when you get, say, a windstorm that knocks a bunch of the mature trees down and then see what comes back up again. And if the hemlock is coming back again, that's great. If it isn't, and not much is coming back, then there's a potential problem. And you've got low preference species that tend to get more common with more browsing. A lot of the ferns will come in. The beech that we've already talked about. Willows in general are not favored as much. Cottonwood and hickories, which are mostly in the southern part of the state. This is a shagbark hickory where the bark just comes scaling off the tree like that, off the trunk. And others that deer tend to avoid are spruce, balsam fir, and red pine, all of which are more in northern Michigan and not in southern Michigan. So once we do the monitoring, what do we want to do with the results? We kind of got an idea that we want to maintain habitat for a lot of different reasons, perhaps. We've got a rough idea what some of the preferred medium and low preference species are. And from that, depending on how we do our counts and how we do our measurements, we can get some estimate of habitat health in general. And we can look at that relative to it might correlate with the condition of the deer or the number of deer and so forth that we then can manage for. And one question we can ask ourselves is, are all the native species, native plant species persisting on the landscape? They are there, and in general, each one of those, there's all kinds of complex relationships between them. Deer forage on a wide variety of native species, so the broader array of native species you have, it's generally positive for the deer and other parts of the habitat. From determining habitat health, then we can begin to look at management options. So we may want to look at our deer density goals based on how we're assessing the health of the habitat. And then proceed apace. Once we've set some deer density goals that are based on our assessment of habitat health, we can try to have more specific questions and decide what species might be encouraged with management and what kind of management is needed to do that. And then how does that go back to our deer harvest goals specifically? And then it's a complicated process, but what Anna will talk about is kind of that first step up here in trying to really determining this habitat health that helps us get a little bit better at looking at these other questions, a little bit more precise. So I'll just leave that with questions, and the idea here again is hopefully we want to protect this kind of habitat rather than this. We'll end up with this. Kind of keep a variety of songbirds in the landscape and keep good populations of deer for hunting and our enjoyment. So that's just kind of the quick overview, and a good time for questions, Anna?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Going back a slide here, when you're talking about the species in your habitat or your density goals, we have crop damage permits that we permit to farmers that the DNR will actually, let you increase your harvest of does or whatever you need to do. But if I guess this goes back to the DNR, why they would not be looking at your natural habitat and the amount of pressure that's put on there to increase doe permits or harvesting on those native species. So I don't think this, I don't know that this question can be directed at you,
Yeah.
but, you know, it is I don't think the DNR actually utilizes the deer density on native species in order to control the herd.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't know, Brent, you want to say anything about that?
I couldn't hear the full part of it, so repeat it quickly for me.
The DNR utilizes deer density and crop damage to be able to control your herd densities for crop damage for farmers. But when you're talking about deer density and the native habitat, why isn't the DNR utilizing native habitat and the amount of damage done on native habitat to control the deer density?
So it's considering impacts of deer on native vegetation is a goal for management. The challenge is we don't have a good systematic measure of it. Really, even when it comes to crop damage, what we have is the complaints or number of permits issue, which isn't always the same as whether crop damage is going. It just tells you whether complaints are going up or down. With many of those things, though, you know, habitat condition, and if there are considerations of impacts on habitat on a hunt club or even on individual property, it is something we can use, say, to authorize deer management assistance permits, additional licenses for landowners to be able to reach management objectives on their property. So we have it as a goal. If we had an indication, say from our state foresters in certain areas or from a number of larger timber property owners that had been systematically looking and saying they observed that there were these types of impacts, it's something that a local biologist should be taken into consideration with their recommendations. But we can't drop, you know, on a map like I did with our antler beam diameter stuff to say is the trend overall up or down, because we just don't have a systematic collection of that kind of information.
Okay.
That's why an option would be for DNR to develop a survey process to landowners, not just hunters. You miss
Sure.
an important segment of the system here by not communicating with landowners to get their assessments.
Yeah, I mean, what you're seeing here tonight is a first step to look at a way, and not through DNR, but working through the collaboration we have here to see what's the potential for using this. It should be of use to property owners. If it scales up enough, if it's manageable enough, it could be something that's of greater use to the department as a whole. Still rolling out, realizing that deer hunters have a great interest in this and are willing to put the time in to become informed about how to be able to collect useful information. But it's not to say you couldn't include landowners other than just deer hunters over time. Yeah.
I know in Osceola County and Lake County, I know 3 exclosures that were established probably quite a few years ago on state land. And I don't know if they're currently used or not to determine browse changes inside or out. But is that part of information you're using currently or not?
There's a variety of, sometimes exclosures are established for monitoring and just in a given area, so it might be an area forester or even a private entity that's doing something like that. We've periodically had different research efforts that have used exclosures as well, both deer and in some of our elk range, to look at it over time. We still don't have a systematic network considering different types of habitat and different land ownerships or anything like that to be able to look at, but there are still some areas that have had these exclosures in place for a period. We've got another effort underway in collaboration with both wildlife and forestry faculty at MSU to also look at evaluating trends of northern hardwood regeneration and looking at deer and forest management practices both that may be potentially contributing to success or lack of success in different areas with regenerating some of our northern hardwood types. So it's something that's been looked at repeatedly. We've never implemented something that's a consistent multiple year of time like our check station data or other things to monitor.
The department there's personnel within the department. If we wanted to have a browse survey done, can we contact the department and there are people there that would come out and do one?
It's not been anything we've worked into a plan to roll out our work planning with field staff at this point. I mean, we have staff, as many of you know, that try and be available when you've got meetings and workshops and other things on a case-by-case basis, but this is something we look to, especially in southern Michigan with the base of private land we have. In northern regions, we do work closely with state forest managers to try and get a general sense of where browsing is occurring, but this is something we looked at trying to roll out to see can we kind of train some leaders that are likely to implement this well from the start and see if it's something that might work. So.
Do you see the effects of deer browse minimized or altered at all in an area with a lot of food plots, per se, or in a heavier ag zone? Alternative food sources?
I don't know. I mean, there's this idea of using lure crops to avoid impacts, whether it's on natural vegetation or on crops. So you've got an agricultural producer, and let's plant crops in some areas to try and encourage deer use here, where we're willing to sacrifice something and keep shortstop them from moving in other places. It's difficult to see a easy, consistent way to plan something like that. Are there instances where you can do that? It's probably a bigger factor in terms of looking at ways that you can provide resources to deer that seasonally migrate and other things where you have areas of concentration than when you have an unknown distribution of deer around the area. Where are deer that are causing damage here coming from and spending their time, and how much work would it take to kind of systematically do that? In general, doing a lot of those things specifically to improve habitat might increase your number of deer, and so actually exacerbate problems if you're not also upping your deer harvest.
My question's for Dave.
Good.
So,
Go stand in the corner.
where in your opinion do you rate sassafras as far as the deer browse?
I didn't check it specifically. My guess would be it's probably not a favorite food because it just has that odor. But I'd have to check it. I can't tell you for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
What about basswood?
Basswood, I think it's kind of in the intermediate to low range. Yeah.
You dealt much with tamarack?
I don't think deer eat tamarack much, so it's pretty safe. Yeah, so that's a good one to come in. Unless they're building a railroad, right? Yeah, better to have white cedar for thermal cover than tamarack, I suspect. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm getting a sense from the whole thing here that we have invasives that are as much of a problem as an overpopulation of deer. Would you agree with that, or would you? I mean, I'm seeing that garlic mustard on my farm has just took over in the last 5 years, 3 years.
Yeah, you're right. Invasives are a huge problem, and sometimes there's a relationship between the deer and the invasive that makes the invasive worse. So if you get a dense patch of garlic mustard and the deer go through it, and the seeds get embedded in the hooves, then the seeds get spread and that kind of stuff.
And my concern would be, okay, I've got this park-like setting, and I bring some light into the understory, and all I'm going to get is a bunch of invasives coming up instead of what I really want.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, pick your poison.
Sometimes that's absolutely right. And even worse than invasive species are things like introduced pathogens like fungus and that sort of stuff where there's virtually no hope of controlling it. So we've got a lot of threats that are affecting deer habitat, and including deer themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So it's trying to figure out what things can you actually do to make the habitat better. And as you say, if you've got a situation where all you have are invasives, a sea of invasives around your plot, it's going to be a tough sell. And you may just want to start with a small parcel and slowly inch out and try to be as thorough as you can and devote 10, 20 years to make it happen.
I don't get it. Get the grandkids.
No, there you go. You got to train the grandkids. There you go.
Just a point on that, you're going to see more of a correlation or connection between disturbance and garlic mustard.
Yep.
Any kind of general disturbance where you talk about opening up and making light, then the deer and the garlic mustard itself, they need a vector, so some way to get in there, and then they need that sunlight, additional sunlight or conditions.
You're right, right. And every time, say, a road gets plowed through or something like that, the garlic mustard tends to come in a lot. But on the other hand, you know, I can get really compulsive about it sometimes. So I've been able to actually eliminate some patches of garlic mustard that are pretty small, but in some cases there was a patch that was maybe 20 by 30 feet. I kept after it for 8 years and it's gone. So start with a small patch. Don't let it get too big.
What practices are you using?
I just pulled it.
Just pulled it.
I just pulled it.
And then burn it or?
No, I win it before it flowered, and then I can just drop it. There was a lot of poison ivy in there too. So.
Where you stand on autumn olives?
Get rid of it.
Nothing, no good for habitat or?
It provides some. It does clearly provide some fruit, but it's pretty low in nutrition for birds. So, and it's so aggressive that it takes over the grasslands and then it takes out the native species. So, at least my personal thought on it is do everything you can to take it out of there. Yeah, it's a tough one. There's no easy answer for that one either.
That being said, what is there something you would recommend to like treat a stump with after you cut a bush like an autumn olive off?
I think people use Tordon.
That's what I would use. I just didn't know if there was something better.
That's the best one I've heard. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Years ago, I attended some DNR hearings in Cadillac about timber cuts, and Nature Conservancy was violently opposed to any cuttings. And have you changed all your theories that you would be supportive of managed cuts, sustainable cuts, such as aspen and that sort of thing?
Sure.
What we do, what we're talking?
Just as an example, in the 200 River area, we've got some land, some of which is held as a nature preserve itself, but we're also working with timber companies up there, and we're doing various kinds of selective cuts to see how we can bring new forest structure back into that area. So organizations evolve and change. So we work with forestry companies a lot, and 20 years ago I worked a lot with timber companies in the eastern UP to look at forest management practices. Yeah. Anna? Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Is it cooling down at all, or is it just stagnant hot?
Hot. We'll go with hot.
All right, well, I've tried.
Wet sauna in here.
There won't be any brows down here.
All right, so up next we have Gary Roloff. He's an associate professor with MSU in the Fisheries and Wildlife Department. He's worked really hard to put together a really good presentation identifying trees. Now the hard part and the tricky part of all of this is that to do this well, you're doing it before we have leaves. So, are you ready to learn some hard stuff?
All right, so I have the challenge of making shrub and tree identification in winter exciting. So hang with me. Well, as Anna mentioned, I'm Gary Roloff. I'm with MSU, Associate Professor in Fisheries and Wildlife. And you know, I'm kind of new to the wildlife co-op game and understanding what it's all about, but I got to tell you, it's some pretty exciting stuff from an outsider kind of looking in. You know, I kind of think about the deer co-ops, and you guys are in a really unique position to manage your deer systems. And, you know, I refer to the deer system as the actual animal. You're managing the population. You're managing the habitat, as Dave talked about, and then you're also managing the people, right? What you guys do on that property and how you behave on that property. And I would make the argument that in order to do that effectively, you need to have information about that system to make smart decisions, to make wise decisions, to make decisions that are effective on the ground that you're trying to manage. And one of the things that Anna's going to try to convince you of today is this. Real quick, what I called the MUCC's Rapid Habitat Assessment. I'm not sure that's what she called it, but I gave it that name, and she'll tell you about it a little bit. But what I'm supposed to do, my job, is to kind of set you guys up so that you could actually implement this process on your property to understand the condition of the deer habitat on the properties you're responsible for. Before I dive in though, because I am a professor, you guys are like, I feel like I have to establish my credibility a little bit with you guys. So I've got a pretty active research lab at MSU, and it's primarily focused on forest-wildlife interactions. So anybody interested in what we do, please go ahead and check out the webpage. Fortunately, when you Google Gary Roloff, the only thing that comes up is my webpage. I think I got all the other stuff filtered out of the system. But Brent mentioned I actually am involved with that hardwood project that some of you might be interested in. It's a long-term project between my lab and a forestry professor's lab, where we're going to look at some pretty aggressive silvicultural techniques in northern hardwood timber types. And the goal is not to remove deer from the system. We're coming at it that we have to figure out a way to regenerate hardwood forests and have deer. And whoever asked about the enclosure question, I've seen some of those enclosures, and the difference is night and day, inside and outside of those things. We know that difference exists. What our challenge is now is not to just show there's a difference, but is to try to develop solutions that let both northern hardwoods and deer coexist on the landscape. So that's what we're going to try to tackle with that project. So for those of you that might have more interest in that, I'm happy to chat with you in a little bit about that. So my whole goal is to give you just some quick identification trips for a few species that are important to this habitat assessment process that Anna would like you to implement on your properties. Now we're going to focus on woody species. Dave Ewer talked a lot about some of the herbaceous plant species. I like to focus on the woody for this assessment because you can do it at any time of the year. Preferably you do it before leaf out so you can real easily see the browse impact. Keep in mind, and both Brent and Dave alluded to this, that your landscape has been heavily impacted by deer for a long time. Deer were extirpated from the state 100 years ago, or almost extirpated 100 years ago. They got hit hard during the Depression once we finished all that logging of the white pine and hardwood forest of Michigan, and then they shot through the roof in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Since that time, your landscapes have been getting hammered by deer in high population areas. And I always like to think back of, I used to hunt on a family farm with central Wisconsin, but we would sit in the same spot for 30 years straight, and everybody would have a comment on how the deer were going up and down and up and down and not paying any attention to what the habitat was doing out there. One year we had a tornado come through and just demolish my grandfather's woods. You couldn't even walk through that stuff. About 4 years later, we started shooting 3.5-year-old bucks. Nice. I got one hanging on my wall at home. So this idea that these landscapes and these habitats are static, that's a picture we got to get out of. Those are constantly changing. The deer are adapting. And as land managers, you have some information about that to help the deer make those decisions. So because deer have been impacting your lands for the last 50 years at a minimum, I think we're actually pretty hard-pressed to find any of the preferred deer food on some of the properties in southern Michigan. They exist, but in a lot of places, they've actually been suppressed to the point where they're really tough to find. But I'm going to show you some of them anyways. One other cautionary note. If you see a deer nibbling or taking a nip out of a non-preferred plant, that doesn't necessarily mean that deer are starving on your property. All right, they'll sample. I've watched them. They'll walk through the woods and they'll just nibble and test and nibble and test. I've seen the same thing with snowshoe hare. There'll be a beech seedling right here, beech seedling right here. This hare will just hammer this beech seed. They're not supposed to eat beech. Something about the makeup of that plant made that beech really palatable to that hare at that time. What Anna's going to encourage you guys to do is do some pretty large-scale sampling, so across your property, because that's where the real strength of these browse surveys come in. You can't just go to one plant, see that it's browsed, and make a decision. You gotta see that plant being browsed over the entire property to really get a sense of what the deer have available to them and what they might be selecting. So keep that in mind. All right, so Dave gave you kind of a lowdown on preference. Let me just real quickly tell you what we're talking about with preference. And I'm going to focus on, for Anna's survey, we're looking at 5 to 6 feet tall max, right? So in the browse zone. All right, so the way to think of preference, let's say you had 3 Bud Lights in every category. The chances of a deer preferring one of those is none, right? Because it's just a random pick. They're all the same. But if I had 3, I'm not a beer connoisseur, craft beers, Founders over here, 3 Bud Lights here, and 3 in the middle, the same amount of beers are available, but the deer pick this one. That's what we mean by preference. So all the food is available, all the beers are available to the deer, and they go and pick one that's based on their preference for the craft beer. All right, so now that creates some problems, right? Because if all the high preference foods are off of your properties already, all they currently have to pick from might be medium and low at this point. So we might be getting a misrepresentation of what the deer really prefer. So that's where these lists come in. High preference woody species. This is the list that Dave kind of ran through, and I might have added a few more. Group them into leaves that are not present in the winter, and then your evergreen or coniferous trees. So a lot of you guys know these. Preferred woody browse, yellow birch, sugar maple, red maple, sumac, red osier dogwood, and nannyberry. That's a type of viburnum species for those of you that know the genus. Of course, conifers preferred are white cedar and white pine. When we go to medium, you get a lot of the species that actually I see being browsed on a lot of properties I visit. I see a lot of aspen being browsed. I see the red oak getting hammered in the northern lower peninsula. Ash, as Dave suggested, that problem's kind of, it's got other issues besides deer browse. The white birch, different from the yellow birch, witch hazel, and then jack pine and eastern hemlock for conifer species. And then the least preferred are this set of species. Now, I would encourage you to focus on these 2 columns, because likely, if they're not in these 2 columns, they're probably in this column. So if you guys leave here with 1 thing tonight, 2 things tonight, I'm going to try to teach you how to at least make a general call on species in these 2 columns. I got some real simple ways to do that, I think.
Where might box elder fit in?
I would say low preference. It's an acer, it's in the maple genus, but I have not seen that get browsed heavy in any of the landscapes I've been in. That's a good one. You guys are going to come up with some that I don't know, and I'm going to have to probably defer to Brent and David as well. But, all right, so let's tackle this thing. How should we go about identifying these species? The first question you want to ask is whether it's deciduous or coniferous, because that narrows down the list. By the way, there's going to be a quiz on this when I get done. I forgot to tell you that. So, when's the last time you guys have had a quiz?
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. What's that?
You just did.
Do we get Bud Light?
Well, hey, there would have been an incentive.
I think we're being profiled.
I think
And he is making this interesting.
That's right. I'm trying to keep the attention span gained here. All right, deciduous species. Get rid of all the conifers. Let's focus on the deciduous. So these are the species that drop their leaves every year. Do not forget to look at what's in the overstory. That should be your first clue as to what might be occurring in the understory. All right, so you guys are walking through your wooded properties, and you're noticing there's sugar maple in the overstory, there's white birch, there's yellow birch, there might be some beech. Those are all cues as to what might be in the understory that are part of this identification process. The birches can be tough to tell apart if you don't know what you're specifically looking for. So if you know you've got one of these, yellow or white, in the overstory, that helps you start narrowing it down. Of course, some understory species keep their leaves throughout the winter. Beech is one that holds through the winter. And then a lot of the oaks will also hold their leaves through the winter, all dried up and dead. So that's the first thing you look for. The next thing, second question, is you figure out if the buds are opposite or alternate. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that with this next slide. Opposite buds mean that the buds are directly opposite each other on the twig. See how those are directly opposite each other? Find another good example, directly opposite. Alternate, the buds alternate their way up the stem. All right, that is a really good second cut at narrowing down which species you're looking at, because there's few opposite species, at least with the deer browse indicators that we're going to look at. All right, so if we go show me the opposite deciduous species, our list gets narrowed down to 5, 4 of which are high preference deer foods. The 2 maples, the red osier dogwood, and the nannyberry. 1 medium preference, ash. All right, let me just now take those 5, and I'll just give you some real quick things you could use in the field on your property to pin them down to which one they really are. All right, the maples. Sugar maple, red maple. Brownish spotted twigs, brownish colored terminal buds, reddish colored twigs, reddish colored terminal buds. Another dead giveaway is on a sugar maple, that terminal bud will look like a cone on the end. In a red maple, it's a lot more rounded or blunt. The red will be real obvious on the buds of the red maple. So if you see a red coloration, really bright, brilliant red, it's almost a dead giveaway that you're dealing with red maple. Opposite, that's what I'm talking about with the opposite. There's 2 buds right there. High preferred browse, so my green coloration here will mean the deer really like it when I have the names up. A lot of you probably know what red osier dogwood. There's a lot of dogwood species out there, but the deer really like red osier dogwood. Now, red osier dogwood, opposite, just like red maple, really red stem. But you see how that bud is much more elongated and kind of got a little flare to it at the end? And if you rip open the stem, there'll be a real nice white inside, real prominent. So that's the kind of the key diagnostic on red osier dogwood. If you're confused between red maple and red osier dogwood, tear one of the stems and you'll see this white pith or the inside of the plant. It'll be real obvious to you. In fact, on some of the samples I brought, if you look at the end, you can see it real clearly in the end of the twig. Another one, nannyberry. These are the actual buds of nannyberry here. This is just the fruiting body from the previous year, so kind of ignore that right now. But the thing I want to point out about nannyberry is look how long these buds are compared to these other opposite species. Real long buds, maybe 3/4 of an inch long. Kind of look like horns at the end of the twig there. Bark color varies from gray to reddish brown, so it's not a real good indicator. All 4 of those are highly preferred deer browse species. Oh, the other thing, I'm glad I had this note up here. On nannyberry, the lateral buds, so the buds that are down on the stem, the tip of the bud will wrap around the stem a little bit, and that's called clasping the stem. Aspen also does that. Quaking aspen, trembling aspen also does that. And you'll be able to see that real clearly on the specimens I brought when I hand them out to everybody. So that's another thing with nannyberry. Look for those leaves to kind of, or the buds to kind of clasp the stem. Okay, so here's a moderate preference or medium preference. The different ash species, I have 3 here, white, black, and green. Generally, ash, big, fuzzy-looking, kind of flat, squat bud on the end of the twig, and usually a really big leaf scar. Okay, it's the only opposite preferred deer browse that'll look like that. White, black, and green are probably the 3 most common species in Michigan. Question?
Yeah, if they're being browsed off, how are you going to tell the difference here?
Usually you got to dig around and you hope there's a twig left that has a bud on it. Yeah, I thought of that actually. I'm ahead of you. All right, so opposite. Now we move into the alternate buds. So remember, they're going alternate the stem. Our list gets a lot bigger, but our preferred species list is pretty short, right? It's basically yellow birch and sumac. All right. Birches, real easy because they do not have a terminal bud or a bud that comes right off the end of the twig. Look at these other pictures. You see how all those buds come right off the end of the twig? Birches, that's actually a lateral bud or a side bud. And that's why it's kicked off to the side like that. So when you see that on the end, that's a good indicator that it's a birch. Yellow birch, if you crush it or you chew on it, it'll have a wintergreen odor or flavor to it as well. Probably why the deer like it. Another really important thing for yellow birch is to look for the adult trees. You know, that kind of goldish yellow flaking bark. That's where that overstory, knowing something about your overstory, comes in handy.
How common is yellow birch in this part of the state?
You know, I was looking for it this weekend to try to get some buds, and I couldn't find it out at Dansville, if that's any indication. We have it on campus in like Baker and Sanford woodlots, but the deer densities are really low there. That's a highly preferred deer food. That's one of the hardwood regeneration issues Michigan is facing, is with that species, yellow birch. Deer really like it. I don't think it's real common in southern Michigan, but I might be wrong on that. I think you all know what sumac looks like. If you just have the twig, though, to look at, you're looking for a tiny round bud that's kind of hairy and a huge leaf scar. So again, we're alternate buds. They're alternating up the stem. Little bitty tiny round bud, big leaf scar. There's a hairy stemmed one in Michigan and a smooth stemmed one in Michigan. Both deer like. And the one I'm going to show you tonight is actually of the smooth variety. The hairy ones are pretty easy to tell. It's a pretty unique stem with all that hair on it.
That one to the far right reminds me of Tree of Heaven. How might you differentiate between Tree of Heaven, as I've seen in some lower wetland areas where you might find sumac?
Do you know what the genus is of that Tree of Heaven?
Aleanthus.
It's all over Dansville.
Is that a native or is that an exotic?
That's an exotic.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So I don't know a lot about that one. I don't know. Do you, Brent, or anybody know does anybody know anything about that particular species?
I have seen them around too.
Okay.
There's a bunch of it out at Dansville State Game Area that was pointed out to me by the Chatfiwa,
Okay.
that
Okay.
they're having some issues with it out there.
Does it get that red cone flower in the
It
fall?
doesn't have the flower, no, but that would be a good
Yeah.
complementary characteristic.
Yeah, that's the first thing I look for is, that sumac usually gets that nice red fruiting body that it carries into the fall. So that'd be maybe a good way to differentiate
You
it.
don't want tomatoes.
All right, so those are preferred. Don't worry, this is going to pick up faster when we get to the conifers. Medium preference are the oaks. Again, alternate buds. And what you're looking for with oaks is that the twigs are kind of stubby and chunky looking, and the leaf scars are usually really close together. That's one of the reasons the twigs look so chunky and stubby. It's because oaks grow slower, right? They got a slower growth rate. I think that on oaks, the terminal buds, they look like a big cluster. Because a lot of times you'll have lateral buds right alongside the terminal buds, and it'll look like there's 4 or 5 buds on that end. And that's another way to potentially identify the oak species. Another medium one a lot of you are familiar with is aspen. The one that's probably one of the easier ones to identify is the quaking aspen, and that's the one where that bud, the tip of that bud wraps around that stem, and that's called clasping the stem. You'll be able to see it real clearly on the specimens that I have. So watch for that when you get it. Big tooth is a little tougher. It's got this real kind of hairy looking terminal bud, but their lateral buds can be highly variable. So what I like to do is if I'm seeing browse on what I think is big tooth, I'll look on the forest floor for the types of leaves that are there from the previous year, and I'll check the overstory just to confirm. Because a big tooth aspen leaf is very distinct. A lot of you probably know it's got the big teeth in it. So that's a tougher one though. And then another medium preference species is another one of the birches. So remember, no lateral bud on the end. The terminal bud's going to kick off to the side. The stems tend to be almost real dark brown and black with spots on them. Does not have that wintergreen odor or taste if you chew on one. And then look for the overstory trees, of course. That's a good indicator. A lot of you guys in the northern lower have witch hazel on your property, I suspect. It has a very distinct bud. To me, it looks like a can opener, one way to remember it. Terminal bud, there's the part that hooks under the lip of the bottle top. That's the part that pries it open. So that's how I remember that one. It just looks like a bottle opener to me. So, witch hazel, pretty easy one. That's a very distinct bud to remember. Let me just real quickly run through some of these non-preferred. So these are the low preference species. And the only reason I want to spend a little bit of time on these is because I have a couple specimens in your quiz bags. Beech, real common in heavy deer browse areas, right? Because deer tend not to prefer or browse on this species. So as a result, the understory species really take off. Big orangish buds. The buds are on a little stem, so it looks like they might be kind of sticking off the branch. Real obvious. And then again, in the winter, look for the leaves, the trees with the leaves on them. That's a good indicator of beech. There's like 25 species of willows in Michigan, and I wasn't going to bore you with identifying 25 species of those. So we're just going to leave them as willows, non-preferred. I do have a cottonwood specimen in the bag. That's another member of the popple or the aspen family group. Low preference though. Okay, so trembling or quaking aspen and big-tooth aspen are medium preference. Cottonwood is a low preference species. You'll see these buds on these kind of little mini branchlets, and the buds are big. They remind me of a little bit smaller than a June bug. Kind of put it into size context. So watch for that one in your bags. And then there's a whole, again, variety of hickories. I have the 4 most common here. low deer browse. I'm not going to spend time trying to get through those. Because again, I think if you focus on the high preference and medium preference, 9 times out of 10, the rest will be in this low preference category. So I'd really try to hone your expertise on the high and the mediums if you decide to do this habitat assessment that Anna's going to talk about. Let's just real quickly do the conifers. I'm not going to go through them one by one. I have one slide for you that summarizes it all, and I'll say a few words about each species. You basically can get them into 3 groups. These 2 are preferred. They have the green text. You got the cedar with the flattened needles. That's a dead giveaway. That's a real easy one to tell. So the needles are all flat. They're not round. Long needled conifers. The needles are more than an inch. You got white pine, jack pine, moderate preference, and red pine. Anybody remember from forestry how you tell the difference between the red and the white?
5 and 3.
5 and 2, actually. Yep. 5 needles in a cluster on white pine. So if you picked out a little cluster of needles, 5 will come all together. If you do that with red pine, 2 will come out. Jack pine is also a 2. But jack pine needles are much shorter. Red pine needles will get 4 to 6 inches long. Jack pine's 1 to 2, and the jack pine needles will twist. It's another way to kind of tell jack pine. High preference, medium preference, low preference. And then your short needle species over here. Anybody have a good way for telling the difference between spruce and fir if you're in the woods? If you take the branch like that, and grab it and try to go like this against the needles, spruce will hurt your hand. Fir won't. Very rigid, pointy, sharp needles. So if you grab that branch and you try to go like that towards the stem, you'll feel it. You won't feel it with balsam fir. Sometimes it's easy to confuse eastern hemlock and balsam fir because their needles actually look pretty similar. Balsam fir will have a little notch in the very end of the needle, most of the time. Hemlock, if you would look at it under a magnifying glass, you'll see little serrations on the needle out at the very end of it. And hemlock needles are a lot shorter overall. You know, they're only 1/4 of an inch long, whereas balsam fir will get up to a 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch long. All right, so if you guys know that, you can implement the habitat assessment protocol that Anna's going to present to you in a few minutes. Any questions on that? Because I know I went through it really fast, but I want to have time to let you guys take a quick look at some of these specimens I brought.
I didn't see cherry trees.
Yeah, that was not one that showed up in either the preferred or the medium list, so I'm thinking that's low.
Okay.
Yeah. By the way, Dave had that list in his presentation, and the DNR also has a web page. You probably saw it. That also gives you some identification advice on some of these species. So it was on one of my slides. I had this slide in here to remind me to talk to you guys that, remember, deer are eating a whole bunch of things out there. Cottontail rabbits was not part of the survey. I'm not sure what the deal is with that one.
You just eliminate the competition.
Yeah, that might be it. Yeah. But I think if we focus on woody browse during the critical time of the year, which is winter, early spring, it can provide a really good index of what's going on your property. This mild winter, what have you guys been seeing? As soon as the snow's gone, where do you see the deer? They're not eating this browse crap, are they? No. They're out in those fields. Yeah, getting all that nice green, succulent fall vegetation growth that was just coming up. Saw a big group of them tonight driving over here.
Where are we?
Yep.
I'm going to take it apple trees are in the high preference.
I don't think they are. I'll have to check on that one. Brent, do you know, or anybody know apple trees, preference-wise? We know I like the fruit, but I don't know about the twigs. They get hit hard in the orchards, I know. Yeah.
Eat the shit out of mine.
Yeah, but in the spring, right? Are they after the?
no, right now.
If you, when I prune my orchard and I throw the stuff out, they're there to clean
They're
it
right
up.
there.
Yeah.
So maybe it is a high preference. Yeah, that one wasn't on our lists. Yeah, good call. All right, so again, here's that web page. If you go in and Google Michigan deer foods, it'll take you to the Michigan DNR web page that'll go through those species in more detail and kind of tell you the preferred and medium and a little bit more identification information. All right, I want to end by pitching a program that I'm actually involved with that we designed to try to help you guys understand the wildlife food on your property. This particular program focuses on mast production, both hard and soft mast, so berries and things like that versus acorns and other things like that. So what we did working with the DNR is we built a web page and a mobile phone app, and the idea is that you guys are all out in the woods all the time. You want to know something about the wildlife food on your properties. A lot of you have cell phones that you carry out there. You're walking under your favorite oak tree and you see it's not producing acorns that year. You hit your phone and it puts it in as a location and you put no acorns. Next year you're going through that same area, you see some more oaks and they're producing acorns like crazy. You hit them in your phone. What you end up doing is you end up building a personal database of mast production for your properties. That would really be informative. I'm talking about having information to make decisions over time. You guys all know how deer respond to white oak acorns. I mean, it's like, no, not. At least where I used to hunt, I'd sit in the white acorn tree producing a bunch of mast. But this is a tool that would let co-ops potentially build a nice database of mast production over time. And you can start correlating that to things, if you're taking antler measurements or buck-doe ratios, things like that, fawning success. So I wanted to make you guys aware of that. Anna had some of the information out on the table. If you're interested in more details on it, it's real simple to use, and your information is kept confidential. The only time you would see it displayed would be at a really coarse scale, like a deer management unit or a county. So there's no way somebody could take your information and go sit in your favorite oak tree to shoot a deer. That's one of the things we've had people say, I'm not giving away my secret spots. But yeah, did you have a question? Okay. It lets you map the location of your mast, so it uses the GPS functions in your cell phone. You put a location in and it shows you right where you are, and then you start building this database. I gave you a little excerpt of mine here. I had a whole bunch of red oak. Took them in August of 2015. I go back to that same area next year and another row would show up. So when you think about having information to make smart decisions for your co-op, man, I could see the co-ops, the members of the co-ops, kind of glomming onto this and really building an impressive database to make decisions on food production on your properties. So I wanted to pitch that to you. We have some help menus to help you identify some of the different mast. And if you would like to talk more about any of this stuff, again, just Google me, and I'm usually really good about replying to any questions you might have. So, thank you very much. I'm not sure where we're at with time, but Anna, do I have time to do my little quiz or not?
It's up to you guys. You guys want to do a quick quiz?
Sure.
10 minutes. 10 minutes tops.
Are you grading on a curve, Gary?
Curves are a thing of the past. Turn on, can you hit the lights? All right, each table, take a quick look, write them down what you think they are. I'll tell you how good you are or not. Maybe split them up.
Is that my book?
Okay, I'll be the scribe.
Nice guy.
We'll see if anybody